All right. I apologize for my video being off. For some reason, I am not able to turn on my camera. We have with us in this session Tim Papa, who is a former supervisory special agent and a certified former profiler with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the BAU. Tim pioneered behavioral content creation while at this unit at BAU, supporting local and state law enforcement cold case investigations across the United States. Tim, I give you the floor now, and you can start.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the introduction. This is a practitioner's case study. It's a case study that I worked on when I was with the FBI, but it's a practice that I've continued since I've left the FBI and gone in the private sector, because it's not something that we typically see in law enforcement, and that is in cases where there's a missing person, an unsolved homicide, that we use content creation, specifically video content creation, to drive the investigation and drive audience behaviors. And this case study is going to really focus on audience behaviors. There's definitely a component to it that involves people involved in the investigation. But that's why I'm talking about public criminology behaviors. At the behavioral analysis unit, a lot of our focus would be on victimology. That was kind of our starting point, right? What's that relationship between a victim and an offender? And that's how we start to shape out who that offender is, whether we know them or not, what kind of person they are, how do they make choices at different points in their life, what kind of context or situations influence their choices. We look at victimology. Criminology is not something we would talk about as much, but in terms of defining criminology, that aspect of how social systems are a part of that, right? In terms of that study of crime and the impact on people. When I'm talking about public criminology behaviors, I'm really talking about people who have information on a case, people who are culpable in a case. Maybe they were responsible for murdering somebody or kidnapping somebody, but we don't know that for sure. And they're still engaging with the public, they're still engaging with law enforcement. And so that's where content creation potentially comes into play in terms of how you communicate things and how you can influence behaviors. And that's what you're going to see today. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my background and introduction to this technique, and then talk a little bit about behavioral content creation. That's the practitioner's model that I developed in the BAU, and it's something that I still do today. And in terms of like a design process and then creating content, this always integrates narrative persuasion. So that's a conceptual framework. I'll talk about that a little bit and how that's integrated with behavioral content creation. And then the case study, I have three short videos from that case study to show you, but I'm also going to show you a little of that design process step by step. And I'm sure there'll still be time for questions if you have questions. So, in terms of my background, I was with the FBI as an agent for about 16 years. In the last 6 years of my time with the FBI, I was a profiler with BAU. Now, my focus there was mainly on cyber behaviors, but because I could create content and I was a videographer, I had the opportunity to start assisting a lot of cases that came in related to crimes against adults or crimes against children. And a lot of those cases were either unsolved homicides, cold cases, or missing persons cases, whether they're cold cases or recent. But this is where I had an opportunity to develop and pioneer this technique. But my understanding of what really gets people to respond to content and narratives goes back to when I was in college and I was studying journalism, and a lot of the work I was doing was investigative journalism. And this is where I really started to experience the way people in a story that I'm interviewing and people that I'm writing for, how they respond to content that has an emotional aspect to it. So whether it was stories about homicides, or one of my first ones I did in college that was an investigative story was the fact that there were a number of coal companies that were overloading coal trucks. And so there was an increasing number of accidents on highways in rural parts of West Virginia and Ohio. And there have been some very deadly accidents, including students from the school I went to, Ohio University. where they were just devastating fatal accidents where they'd be turning a corner or there'd be a collision. And part of the reason those students died is because that truck couldn't complete a stop in time or a turn safely, and so all this coal would spill over, and just like terrible details, right? Of like their lungs full of coal, but pulling out those details and telling the story of like someone's last moments and the loss that that family's going through, nothing novel in that respect. But for me, for as a firsthand experience, I really saw people respond to that. And I saw it impact things subsequently too, in terms of how companies responded, policies that would change at school. So I started to experience the power of it. Moving on in graduate school, I spent time over in Indonesia doing research, studying communication practices. And the way I did that is I was living in Islamic boarding schools in Indonesia, shadowing Muslim proselytizers. And these Muslim proselytizers in particular were very progressive minded. So I wanted to understand, like, is there actually a network of progressive minded Muslim proselytizers? And if there is, can I detail that network? And how do they network, right? But what I started to see also was, how is it that there are these audiences that are very dynamic and diverse? They're generational. And on paper, generally speaking, they would probably disagree with almost everything that progressive minded proselytizer would talk about, but they love them. And I'm like, why do they like this guy so much? Why do they respond to him? Why do they find him to be so authentic? And this is again where I started to see firsthand these aspects of authenticity and depth and how people respond to that. This started to show me the building blocks for this model of behavioral content creation, which I'll explain in more detail shortly. But this is where I started to see it, that even when you have people that are so different and that there are contrasts and could be conflict, when you engage them and you're vulnerable and you have dialogues that include affect or it's emotional and things like that, can really connect with people. People tend to trust you more, or they respect you more because they find you to be an authentic person. It's very critical. And of course, that crosses over into my work when I was at the behavioral analysis unit as a profiler, looking at people online, behaviors online. Because what is it about somebody online that makes them authentic or not? Especially when people already have an elevated sense of deception and scrutiny and concern about things online and people online, because maybe they don't know who you really are or it's anonymized. That's an interesting space in terms of a parallel. And my experiences in Indonesia carried over into my experiences in learning and application at BAU, trying to understand that. And if you can understand what makes people authentic to other people, well, you can manage that process, right? To create content and create representations of people that other people find authentic. And sometimes it's fictional and sometimes it's not, depending on the context. But this is also at BAU where I had further introduction to theories that really were relevant here, like warranting theory. Warranting theory is a theory of evaluation of content online. And it really comes down to, when you're looking at something online, like a website or someone's selling something on eBay, how likely is it that that content has been manipulated by somebody? That's what warranting theory is. You're warranting that content. You're making your own evaluation. Whether you're trained in this or not, it doesn't matter. We all do it. We make some kind of evaluation of how likely is it this has been manipulated in some way by whoever possesses it. There's a famous study on this that was done on eBay, and they specifically looked at packages of golf balls and which pictures would get more bids and more purchases. And the two different pictures were, one, a stock photo of a package of golf balls, and the other was a real picture taken of a package of golf balls on someone's basement rug, and the rug was kind of dirty. And as they expected, the picture of a package of golf balls on the basement rug got far more bids and far more purchases. And that's a demonstration of warranting theory, because they concluded people more than likely thought this is probably a real person selling this package of golf balls, and the stock photo might be a scam. But that's how you see that demonstrated. And so that's an example of application of other theories and frameworks to behaviors in behavioral analysis at the BAU as a profiler, and then having the opportunity to create content and apply it, and then see what happens online, see how people respond to it. It's also a crucial step of that process. And that's a fortunate step for me because sometimes there's that divide between some academics and practitioners where there might be theories and there might be lab based experiments or there might be artificial experiments. And yes, there's rigor there for sure, especially if you're trying to control certain variables. And you don't always have that, of course, in another environment as a practitioner where you're also trying to study it. But you get to see what works and what doesn't in real world environments. So there's value to both. And I had the opportunity to see it in the real world. So sure, I was already kind of familiar with industry marketing practices and consumer psychology, but this was an opportunity, whether it was in support of these cold cases or in some national security stuff, to create content, put it online, put it out there in support of cases and see how the people respond to it. And again, also applying the kind of research that's out there about why audiences share certain types of content and why they believe the things they do. But that's really the foundation of my approach here. So when you're talking about behavioral content creation, I know this isn't very detailed, but I don't think it has to be at this point. Sure, I could probably spend an hour going through the different domains of like or fields of research literature that back this up. There is that. But in terms of sharing with you briefly as an introduction, what do these models look like? And then I'll demonstrate it for you. That's the aspect of this being a practitioner's case study. I break it up into two approaches when I'm talking about behavioral content creation. One's a consumer approach. And I say that because I'm essentially saying there's not necessarily an identified audience segment. If you think about it in marketing terms, there's not a target audience, even in investigative terms. It's just much more broad, right? This could be for everybody. And so this is pulling on those aspects of why people share the kind of content they do. The examples you'll see today have variations of both consumer and concentrated, but a consumer approach is still just a conceptual model and that dimensionally integrates affect and vulnerability. And by dimensionally, I'm talking about sharing content that really has depth and authenticity to it and shows people that appear to have depth and authenticity. And it's integrating those two things. You've got to have that an aspect of affect to the content and vulnerability to the content in terms of how people are sharing, disclosing things on camera and what they're talking about. There needs to be an aspect of vulnerability. People tend to trust that more and respond to it more. And by affect, I'm talking about things that are hard to articulate that you're feeling, but you know you feel it. That's a very general definition of affect. Sometimes affect can also be called a mood, and that's not meant to be dismissive. Moods, affect, it's very promiscuous because it can be an underlying range of feeling that you have that you can't quite put your finger on, but you feel it. And that's something that a lot of people share, even if they can articulate it different ways. But that's why it's so powerful. It's actually more powerful than, say, just talking about one labeled emotion. A concentrated approach is similar, but there's slight differences, right? You still being dimensional in terms of the content you're creating, but it's much more relational. And I'm talking about you're considering the relationships between people in particular that you're trying to reach with that content. You are trying to communicate something to a specific person or a specific group of people, and their relationships come into play. And you don't always know that as an investigator, but sometimes you do, or you have an impression or a suggestion about those relationships. And really, what I've seen in the past as a profiler that was really the most consistent thing about how people make choices. A lot of it does come down to their relationships with other people because their choices impact other people too, sometimes the people closest to them. So, a concentrated approach is a conceptual model that dimensionally and relationally integrates emotions and vulnerabilities. It could be more than one vulnerability. And I say emotions this time because now I'm talking about labeled emotions. The difference between affect and emotions is with emotions, you have a label like sad, happy, joyful, because you've made some kind of evaluation, some kind of interpretation of it. And that's why you've labeled it as such. It's object driven. you can say that thing, that event, that person made me feel this way. That's a labeling and interpretation of an event, person, thing. And that's why we say it's emotion. That's a little bit different than affect, right? Where you can't always articulate it. Concentrated kind of represents that in terms of like we have some very defined things and defined people and defined objectives. So that's a very basic primer on behavioral content creation of two different approaches that you can take or a blend of it. And finally, in terms of this approach, when we want to integrate narrative persuasion, um, if you're not that familiar with narrative persuasion as a concept in research literature, you do experience it every day. Narrative persuasion is really just a different approach to communicating stories about people, and they can be real or fictional stories, but it's a coherent story with characters making choices in their lives, right? It's a different way of trying to influence people because you're not taking an informational or logical approach of like, these are the reasons why you should do A, B, and C, or here's a pro con list of why you should do this or that. Narrative persuasion tells a story instead and demonstrates or reveals people's choices in contexts and situations that you might relate with. So when they've explored narrative persuasion, how that impacts people, they've seen a number of different things. One thing they've seen sometimes is that people transport while they're reading a story or watching a story, they're thinking about it while they're actually watching it or reading it. They're thinking about moments in their lives, maybe lives of other people they know. And that's where there's potentially a connection. It's also been referred to as narrative engagement. And other people reflect on stories in this framing narrative persuasion afterwards. So there's different ways that people can experience it, and it's not necessarily that it's going to change somebody's whole worldview or that they fully accept the message of that story, but it can definitely impact it. It can definitely influence it to some degree. That's why it's so powerful. And when you go back to content again, the studies we've consistently seen on why people share what they share online is but 9 times out of 10, right? If it's not emotional, the content, people aren't really going to share it. Non-emotional content doesn't really go anywhere, but emotional content does. And there's other aspects to that in terms of does it anger people? Does it excite them? Does it disgust them? There are different categories there in terms of like that hierarchy of arousal. But we consider all this, right? I considered all this when I'm creating content, video content that's behaviorally based. So the behavioral aspect to it is considering all these frameworks, right? Of like how people respond to the framing of the story, how people respond to content that's emotional, and how people in particular that I'm trying to reach and I'm trying to align those behavioral goals with an investigative goal, how it impacts them behaviorally. All those things go into it. That is a dimensional approach, right? Because people are complicated and dimensional, and that's what we're trying to achieve there. So the final portion of this study is going to be the case study. We're going to walk you through briefly what the steps were in this case study. And this case study in particular goes back a few years. The videos I'm pulling are from FBI's public YouTube page. I made these videos when I was still a profiler at BAU. And it was about a teenager named Carly Guse who went missing in California, in a desert area of California. And this case had national attention. So, step one in any of these situations is trying to characterize the environment and see can we align behavioral goals to the investigation goals. And of course, I can't share all the investigation goals related to that, but in terms of some of those goals were related to general audiences and people who might have information that haven't come forward yet, and people who may have had some involvement in this who haven't come forward yet. Maybe we know them, maybe we don't. The other issue with this case is it was a very saturated environment online because it had national attention. The parents of this missing teenager had gone on Dr. Phil. They had gone on Nancy Grace, and by most accounts, their performance on the shows was not good. Is not well received, and there appeared to be a growing concern and belief among a lot of people that the parents were somehow responsible for their daughter missing, and that's concerning. to law enforcement, because regardless of who is responsible or what happened, when people, generally speaking, when people think the family is responsible, they stop paying attention, they stop coming forward, they stop sharing tips and information. And that's not good, right? It's important that people continue to feel like, even if they're not sure if it's important, that they come forward and share that information. But this is a very saturated case. As an example, there was a private Facebook group online just on this missing teenager, and it had something like over 19,000 people in it. It was a private Facebook group. So we definitely had an issue of like, it's a saturated space. There's a lot of content out there about Carle Guse already. So how do we get them to look at the content we want them to look at without paying for advertising? Because it's still the government and law enforcement, and they're not going to spend a lot of money on that. So two of the main goals that I can share that were part of this case study, one was trying to channel the attention of this broad public audience, including people we knew about and people we didn't know about who might have relevant information, to land at our landing pages online to see our content and to see our information. We wanted to channel their attention and where they go online into our space. And the second thing was actually repairing reputations. I wanted viewers to see this family a little bit differently, as much more dynamic and having much more depth than people might realize. Because if it's possible that the family didn't have anything to do with their daughter missing, that's an issue in terms of public criminology behaviors, that people aren't coming forward and they're just assuming that the family's responsible. And that could really hurt the investigation and hurt a lot of other things too. So I at least wanted to present these family members in a much more dynamic way. And this goes back to that consumer approach, right? Showing vulnerability and showing affect, and sometimes emotions and sometimes relationships. There's a blend of both in this case. Step two is kind of storyboarding who and where in the narratives that might be part of that interview and discussion. When I'm not like from that area up in Northern California, I'm not going to know everything that's possible when I fly out there in terms of where we can film them, when they'll be available. I try to plan for it in terms of like, who should we talk to and what might they talk about and what might we ask them about. Well, a major part of this is persuasion. If you're familiar with Robert Cialdini's book Persuasion from 2016, he talks about a number of different areas of persuasion, and persuasion is a little bit different than prompting someone or priming someone, because persuading is you're trying to get their attention and then hold it. And this is about making them that much more responsive to that content before they even get that content. And one aspect of that is something called persuasive geographies. And that's not just a physical space that can impact, how you respond to things that you're discussing. It's a mental and emotional place as well. And so I tried to keep that in mind, that it doesn't matter where I film them, because it could impact how they respond during the interview, and it could impact audiences too in terms of how they respond to it. So I'm thinking about locations as a stage potentially. Step three is the interview. Of course, again, I don't know everywhere it's going to go for this in particular, because I like the book The Things They Carry by Tim O'Brien, where he talks about people who, it's based off his own life, but there's some fiction to it, but about the things they carry during his experience in Vietnam and after, that it's not just physical objects, but it's mental and emotional burdens too in their life. And so in these interviews, actually would bring that up as a framing aspect to it, to get them to start thinking about the things that they carry in their life. And I apologize if you hear those signs in the background that's going by. But motivational interviewing is usually the way I would interview these individuals, because, of course, they're voluntarily agreeing to go on camera. And I want to put them at ease, and I want to talk about their origin story and their life story. And motivational interviewing is all about guiding someone in an interview and being with them on that discussion, rather than something that's much more confrontational or challenging. And my questions were meant to elicit affect from them. So you're not going to see this video today, but one of my examples was talking to the father of this missing teenager. And it just so happened that he hadn't been in his daughter's room for 2 years. They had closed the door, they didn't want anyone going in there. So I thought, this is a great moment to open that door. Let's film you in your daughter's room talking about your daughter. That's a persuasive geography, right? Because he's going to be going through a lot of emotions and affect that he's feeling at the same time. When you have situations where there's concerns about a family too, um, that they might have some involvement in investigation, creating cognitive and emotional overloads during discussions and interviews can be critical too. When people are in some state of cognitive and emotional overload, it's much more difficult for them to be deceptive. So that's another piece that's kind of built in. And finally, step four, the way I edit these, I'm probably interviewing them for like 40, 45 minutes. That's a lot of content. And my questions are going to be relatively soft, right? Like, tell me about the last discussion you had with her. Do you ever dream about her? Those kind of questions. Those are not threatening or challenging questions, and it allows people to really think about it, and they tend to go to a very emotional space. And this is where I tend to be able to frame it so people get to see that vulnerability and they get to see that affect. That's very important for audiences. When you want them to respond to it, you want them to engage with it, and you want them to share it. That's a demonstration of how you prepare for and then create that content. And that's what I was trying to do when I would edit it. The fluency aspect to it is really focusing on short videos that are 90 seconds or less, if possible, with one person in that video. Marketing trends will tell you that's the way to go, because if you have long videos with a lot of different people, this is what you typically see in law enforcement. People don't really stay to watch that. And it's a lot of people to think about and a lot of different aspects of the story to think about. When you focus on one person, it's much more fluent in terms of the processing of it. So now what I'm going to show you is 3 short samples of videos from this video series. And after each video, I'll briefly talk about what I did there and how I applied this model of behavioral content creation. Here's the first one. And this is going to be Carly Gousset's stepmother, who publicly a lot of people tended anecdotally to not trust her. They tended to not find her to be authentic or credible. So I knew that going into this. And so, of course, you can draw your own conclusions after you watch it. But here we go. Sorry.
I miss driving her to school. I miss working with her because she worked with me. I miss arguing with her. I miss her stealing my clothes out of my closet. I just miss all the little things that you take for granted. What else to say? This life's not fair. You feel like you're failing at it all because you don't have an answer and you just don't have anything. Going out and searching, walking this whole entire thing, driving for days, walking across Fish Slough, the helicopters, everything. And all we could find was her footprint. And it was just, you need to go search more. You need to go do this. Everybody has their advice. But you don't know what advice to give because you don't know you're not in those person's shoes. The only good advice that anybody ever gave me was just keep hopeful. Because your mind wanders.
So with that one, it was important to me to share aspects of what she's talking about, how intertwined her daily life was with Carly. I wanted shots where you get to see who we're talking about and what this town looks like without going into all these informational type of details. Like, this is what this case is about. This is where it's located. You can blend that into content much more elegantly than doing it that way. Showing her crying with tears. Some people have taken that as they can't really see her tears. I was purposeful in terms of filming her at the end and backing up a little bit So when she's talking about her mind wandering, we also see this vastness of space out there. You can take that a lot of different ways. We're literally in the place where Carly Guse was last seen. She may have wandered off into that desert, and her body could be out there. So I wanted to bring her that place instead of having her stepmom, Melissa Guse, in some room somewhere where she wouldn't have been in that place mentally, physically, or emotionally. But that's the design of trying to create those moments and share that with people in ways they wouldn't normally see. And then finally, the music choice. Timing is important. Music with imagery is the quickest way to elicit an emotional response from people watching it. And there's design behind that in terms of like what kind of music or instrumental maybe I pick, and what you're feeling when you see certain images with the music. It's different for everybody. But again, the whole idea is there's a way to, as a consumer approach to behavioral content creation, to create that effect. So now for the next one, this is a video with one of Carly's Gousse's, the missing teenagers, stepbrothers. I'll play it and then tell you what I was trying to do with this one.
Last time I saw her was probably at my mom's house. She was mad at me because I wasn't really. It was like the last couple days we were hanging out there, and they were in the kitchen, and I was trying to like be funny and shoot like a paper towel into like the laundry basket, and then she was being all mad. I was like, "Do you need a hug?" And I didn't have my shirt on, and she's like, "Ew, you feel like wet ham," and we were all laughing because of that. It was funny. Yeah, that was probably the last time I saw her, or that I can remember of it. I would always try to be like her because it was like, it was just weird, I don't know. Like, everybody was like, "She's not your sister, you don't look anything like her," but like, when you'd compare us, we looked a lot alike. And it's like, people still don't really believe that she's my sister, and I compare her as my sister anyways. Like, I think about her, and it's confusing, because it's like life has just been normal, and it's like she hasn't even really been gone, but it seems like people have been forgetting about her a lot more and not really thinking much about her.
So this one, he's kind of an outlier, not really someone to come up in an investigation or publicly. I liked talking to him because even though he had like a silly random story about the wet ham story, those are the kind of details that people tend to remember because it's unusual, right? I had a creative writing teacher in college who said, "We've seen like a million stories where there's a guy drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. No one's going to remember that. We have like a million images in our mind of that. But if you wrote a story about you walk into a diner and there's an octopus smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, people will remember that." So those kind of things are important to include. That's what I chose after interviewing him for like half an hour. You also could see the glistening on his eyes. What a different representation of affect, right? And even though I made that and I've seen this a million times, I still had goosebumps when I saw that because I'm seeing someone else in a vulnerable state. I'm seeing someone else in a state of affect, and I respond to it. I'm human. Audiences do too. The final video I'm going to show you is Carly's younger brother, and this one had the most views by far, about like 70,000 views.
It's like my body's telling me that she's still here, but we have absolutely no clue in the right mind where. So my body's thinking, oh, she's here. We just don't see her. She's invisible. I don't know. Or she's gone. I don't know. She might. Whenever I think about her and like where she would be, like most of my body says like she's like, I don't know, in Hawaii or somewhere on a beach or just having fun, hanging out with a bunch of new friends that she made when she was gone, and then she was coming back fine. And then the other little bit of part of me is like, she's probably dead. She got stolen, and then she got just a little bit of tiny me, like a handful of me is just feeling that, and then the rest of my body's just feeling good parts. So the bad part would be like she's getting abused, or I don't know. She's probably sitting in a dark room in a chair, tied up, just sitting there, dying of hunger, thirst, and light, and probably dead. Sorry.
So, the results of that. In all, it was a 12 video series. They're all short video series like that. Quite unusual for the FBI and law enforcement to put so much content out there like that. One of the goals of getting people to come to our landing pages was achieved for many years. I don't know what it is currently, but for many years, whenever you put in Carla Gousset, Zach Gousset, or Melissa Gousset, the top search returns each time on Google were the FBI landing pages. So in terms of organic search engine optimization, that was quite an achievement. And it was all based off of, yes, there's over 200,000 subscribers on the FBI's YouTube page, but there certainly were all kinds of other influencers that were making videos about Carla while they're putting on their makeup, and they might have like 1 million views. This didn't have that kind of viewage, right, in terms of people, but it had a lot of engagements. So I think like that one video had over 1,000 likes of Cole Gousset. That was one goal that we did achieve because we wanted to channel visitors online and viewers to that. Now, the second goal of changing people's impressions, that's maybe impossible to measure. But I think given what we put out there, we definitely presented a different kind of perspective on this family. And there are aspects of how this potentially impacted the investigation too that I can't share. But in terms of influencing relationships in that town and in that family, because of this different kind of narrative and this different kind of approach, it did have an impact on the case. You can't always look at things in terms of how many tips come in, and that's not like a self-serving measurement. It's just the reality of like that's not always the degree of success. But this certainly was one demonstration in terms of trying to channel attention, maintain that viewership, and do it in an organic way and make the content so it does have an impact. This was a successful example of an effective case study of using behavioral content creation as an approach. And if there's any questions, please let me know.
We do have questions, but I'm afraid we don't have any time. We're past the time and we need to close in order to open the next session.
Sure.
But if anybody has any questions, we invite you to post them in Whova and we can direct them to the speakers after the conference. We hope to see you in the following sessions. Tim, you'll be speaking as well later, so we'll see you again.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for your time.